Linux is a Unix-like and mostly POSIX-compliant computer operating system, assembled under the model of free and open-source software development and distribution. The defining component of Linux is the Linux kernel, an operating system kernel first released on 5 October 1991 by Linus Torvalds. The Free Software Foundation uses the name GNU Linux to describe the operating system, which has led to some controversy. Linux was originally developed as a free operating system for personal computers based on the Intel x86 architecture, but has since been ported to more computer hardware platforms than any other operating system. Thanks to its dominance on smartphones, Android, which is built on top of the Linux kernel, has the largest installed base of all general-purpose operating systems. Linux, in its original form, is also the leading operating system on servers and other big iron systems such as mainframe computers and virtually all fastest supercomputers, but is used on only around 1.6% of desktop computers, with Linux-based Chrome OS taking about 5% of the overall and nearly 20% of the sub-$300 notebook sales. Linux also runs on embedded systems, which are devices whose operating system is typically built into the firmware and is highly tailored to the system. This includes smartphones and tablet computers running Android and other Linux derivatives, TiVo and similar DVR devices, network routers, facility automation controls, televisions, video game consoles, and smartwatches. The development of Linux is one of the most prominent examples of free and open-source software collaboration. The underlying source code may be used, modified and distributed, commercially or non-commercially, by anyone under the terms of its respective licenses, such as the GNU General Public License. Typically, Linux is packaged in a form known as a Linux distribution, for both desktop and server use. Some of the popular mainstream Linux distributions of Debian, Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora, OpenSUSE, Arch Linux and Gentoo, together with commercial Red Hat Enterprise Linux and SUSE Linux Enterprise Server distributions. Linux distributions include the Linux kernel, supporting utilities and libraries, and usually a large amount of application software to fulfill the distribution's intended use. Distributions oriented toward desktop use typically include a windowing system, such as X11, Mir or a Wayland implementation, and an accompanying desktop environment, such as No More the KDE software compilation. Some distributions may also include a less resource-intensive desktop, such as LXDE or XFCE. Distributions intended to run on servers may omit all graphical environments from the standard install, and instead include other software to set up an operator solution stack such as LAMP. Because Linux is freely redistributable, anyone may create a distribution for any intended use. History. Antecedents. The Unix operating system was conceived and implemented in 1969 at AT&T's Bell Laboratories in the United States by Ken Thompson, Dennis Ritchie, Douglas McIlroy, and Joe Ossanna. First released in 1971, Unix was written entirely in assembly language as it was common practice at the time. Later, in a key pioneering approach in 1973, it was rewritten in the C programming language by Dennis Ritchie. The availability of a high-level language implementation of Unix made its porting to different computer platforms easier, due to an earlier antitrust case forbidding it from entering the computer business. AT&T was required to license the operating system's source code to anyone who asked. As a result, Unix grew quickly and became widely adopted by academic institutions and businesses. In 1984, AT&T divested itself of Bell Labs, freed of the legal obligation requiring free licensing. Bell Labs began selling Unix as a proprietary product. The new project, started in 1983 by Richard Stallman, had the goal of creating a complete Unix-compatible software system, composed entirely of free software. Work began in 1984. Later, in 1985, Stallman started the Free Software Foundation and wrote the new General Public License in 1989. By the early 1990s, many of the programs required in an operating system were completed, although low-level elements such as device drivers, daemons, and the kernel were stalled and incomplete. Linus Torvalds has stated that if the new kernel had been available at the time, he would not have decided to write his own. Although not released until 1992 due to legal complications, development of $386 Bahamian, from which NETBSD, OpenBSD and FreeBSD descended, predated that of Linux. Torvalds has also stated that if $386 Bahamian had been available at the time, he probably would not have created Linux. Minix was created by a computer science professor, Andrew S. Tannenbaum, and released in 1987 as a minimal Unix-like operating system targeted at students and others who wanted to learn the operating system principles. Although the complete source code of Minix was freely available, the licensing terms prevented it from being free software until the licensing changed in April 2000. Creation in 1991, while attending the University of Helsinki, Torvalds became curious about operating systems and frustrated by the licensing of Minix, which at the time limited it to educational use only. He began to work on his own operating system kernel, which eventually became the Linux kernel. Torvalds began the development of the Linux kernel on Minix, and applications written for Minix were also used on Linux. Later, Linux matured and further Linux kernel development took place on Linux systems. New applications also replaced all Minix components. Because it was advantageous to use the freely available code from the new project with the fledgling operating system code licensed under the new GPL can be reused in other projects as long as they also released under the same or a compatible license. Torvalds initiated a switch from his original license, which prohibited commercial redistribution, to the new GPL. Developers worked to integrate new components with the Linux kernel, making a fully functional and free operating system. Naming Linus Torvalds had wanted to call his invention FreeX, a portmanteau of free, freak, and X. During the start of his work on the system, he stored the files under the name of FreeX for about half of a year. Torvalds had already considered the name Linux, but initially dismissed it as too egotistical. In order to facilitate development, the files were uploaded to the FTP server of FUNET in September 1991. Ari Lemke, Torvalds' co-worker at the Helsinki University of Technology, who was one of the volunteer administrators for the FTP server at the time, did not think that FreeX was a good name. So, he named the project Linux on the server without consulting Torvalds. Later, however, Torvalds consented to Linux. To demonstrate how the word Linux should be pronounced, Torvalds included an audio guide with the kernel source code. Another variant of pronunciation is Linux, Linux. Commercial and popular uptake adoption of Linux in production environments, rather than being used only by hobbyists, started to take off first in the mid-1990s in the supercomputing community, where organizations such as NASA started to replace their increasingly expensive machines with clusters of inexpensive commodity computers running Linux. Commercial use followed when Dell and IBM, followed by Hewlett-Packard, started offering Linux support to escape Microsoft's monopoly in the desktop operating system market. Today, Linux systems are used in every domain, from embedded systems to supercomputers, and have secured a place in server installations, often using the popular LAMP application stack. Use of Linux distributions in home and enterprise desktops has been growing. Linux distributions have also become popular in the netbook market, with many devices shipping with customized Linux distributions installed, and Google releasing their own Chrome OS designed for netbooks. Linux's greatest success in the consumer market is perhaps the mobile device market, with Android being one of the most dominant operating systems on smartphones and very popular on tablets and, more recently, on wearables. Linux gaming is also on the rise, with Valve showing its support for Linux and rolling out its own gaming-oriented Linux distribution. Linux distributions have also gained popularity with various local and national governments, such as the federal government of Brazil. Current development Torvalds continues to direct the development of the kernel. Stallman heads the Free Software Foundation, which in turn supports the new components. Finally, individuals and corporations develop third-party non-GNU components. These third-party components comprise a vast body of work and may include both kernel modules and user applications and libraries. Linux vendors and communities combine and distribute the kernel, GNU components, and non-GNU components, with additional package management software in the form of Linux distributions. Design. A Linux-based system is a modular Unix-like operating system, deriving much of its basic design from principles established in Unix during the 1970s and 1980s. Such a system uses a monolithic kernel, the Linux kernel, which handles process control, networking, access to the peripherals, and file systems. Device drivers are either integrated directly with the kernel, or added as modules that are loaded while the system is running. Separate projects that interface with the kernel provide much of the system's higher-level functionality. The GNU userland is an important part of most Linux-based systems, providing the most common implementation of the C library, a popular CLI shell, and many of the common Unix tools which carry out many basic operating system tasks. The graphical user interface used by most Linux systems is built on top of an implementation of the X Windows system. More recently, the Linux community seeks to advance to Wayland as the new-to-display server protocol in place of X11. Ubuntu, however, develops Mir instead of Wayland. Installed components of a Linux system include the following: a bootloader, for example GNU Grab, Lilo, SYSLINUX, Coreboot or Gummy Boot. This is a program that loads the Linux kernel into the computer's main memory, by being executed by the computer when it is turned on and after the firmware initialization is performed. An init program, such as the traditional sysvinit and the newer systemed OpenRC and Upstart. This is the first process launched by the Linux kernel, and is at the root of the process tree. In other terms, all processes are launched through a niche. It starts processes such as system services and login prompts. Software libraries, which contain code that can be used by running processes. On Linux systems using L-format executable files, the dynamic linker that manages use of dynamic libraries is known as ld-linux.so. If the system is set up for the user to compile software themselves, header files will also be included to describe the interface of installed libraries. Beside the most commonly used software library on Linux systems, the GNU C library, there are numerous other libraries. C standard library is the library needed to run standard C programs on a computer system, with the GNU C library being the most commonly used. Several alternatives are available, such as the glibc and uclibc. Widget toolkits are the libraries used to build graphical user interfaces for software applications. Numerous widget toolkits are available, including GTK+ and Clutter developed by the GNOME project, Qt developed by the Qt project and led by Digia, and Enlightenment Foundation libraries developed primarily by the Enlightenment team. User interface programs such as command shells or windowing environments. User interface. The user interface, also known as the shell, is either a command line interface, a graphical user interface, or through controls attached to the associated hardware, which is common for embedded systems. For desktop systems, the default mode is usually a graphical user interface, although the CLI is available through terminal emulator windows or on a separate virtual console. CLI shells are the text-based user interfaces, which use text for both input and output. The dominant shell used in Linux is the GNU Bourne-Again shell, originally developed for the GNU project. Most low-level Linux components, including various parts of the userland, use the CLI exclusively. The CLI is particularly suited for automation of repetitive or delayed tasks, and provides very simple inter-process communication. On desktop systems, the most popular user interfaces are the GUI shells, packaged together with extensive desktop environments, such as the K desktop environment, GNOME, Cinnamon, Unity, LXDE, Pantheon and XFCE, though a variety of additional user interfaces exist. Most popular user interfaces are based on the X Windows system, often simply called X. It provides network transparency and permits a graphical application running on one system to be displayed on another where a user may interact with the application. However, certain extensions of the X Windows system are not capable of working over the network. Several popular X display servers exist, with the reference implementation, Xorg server, being the most popular. Several types of window managers exist for X11, including tiling, dynamic, stacking and compositing. Window managers provide means to control the placement and appearance of individual application windows, and interact with the X Windows system. Simpler X window managers such as DWM or Rapwozen provide a minimalist functionality, while more elaborate window managers such as FVWM, Enlightenment or Window Maker provide more features such as a built-in taskbar and themes, but are still lightweight when compared to desktop environments. Desktop environments include window managers as part of their standard installations, such as Mata, Quinn or XFWM, although users may choose to use a different window manager if preferred. Wayland is a display server protocol intended as a replacement for the X11 protocol. As of 2014 update, Wayland has not received wider adoption. Unlike X11, Wayland does not need an external window manager and compositing manager. Therefore, a Wayland compositor takes the role of the display server, window manager and compositing manager. Western is the reference implementation of Wayland, while GNOME's Mata and KDE's Quinn are being ported to Wayland as standalone display servers. Enlightenment has already been successfully ported to Wayland since version 19. Video input infrastructure. Linux currently has two modern kernel user space APIs for handling video input devices: V4L2 API for video streams and radio, and DVB API for digital TV reception. Due to the complexity and diversity of different devices, and due to the large amount of formats and standards handled by those APIs, this infrastructure needs to evolve to better fit other devices. Also, a good user space device library is the key of the success for having user space applications to be able to work with all formats supported by those devices.